In early 2020, the streets of Minsk looked calm, almost sleepy. Cafes served coffee under faded Soviet-era facades, children played in small courtyards, and the police patrolled with the slow confidence of men who knew no one would dare challenge them. Beneath the surface, however, Belarus was a country held together by fear, habit, and the firm grip of one man, Alexander Lukashenko. For 26 years, Lukashenko had ruled Belarus like a personal estate. He was not just the president, he was the Batka, the father of the nation, a title he encouraged with a farmer's simplicity and a policeman's authority. Elections were held, yes, but their outcomes were never in doubt. The opposition existed largely on paper, media outlets were state-controlled, and even jokes about politics could invite a knock on the door late at night. Ordinary Belarusians had learned a quiet survival strategy. Keep your head down, don't discuss politics in public, and if the president's name came up, change the subject. In Belarus you can think anything you like, an old saying went, as long as you keep it in your kitchen. Yet the calm was deceptive. The economy was stagnating, younger generations were restless, and the president's folksy image had begun to wear thin. Lukashenko's open dismissal of the COVID-19 pandemic, telling citizens to drink vodka, drive tractors, and visit saunas, was met with disbelief and ridicule, even among his usual supporters. The ground was shifting, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and when it finally cracked, it would catch nearly everyone by surprise, including a stay-at-home mother named Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, with whom this story begins. The concrete apartment building in Mikashevichy looked like thousands of others across the Soviet Union, grey, functional, and utterly ordinary. But in September 1982, as autumn painted the Belarus countryside in shades of gold and crimson, something extraordinary was quietly beginning in one of its modest flats. Sviatlana Pilipchuk entered the world just as the Soviet Empire was beginning its slow, invisible decline, though no one could have imagined then that this baby girl would one day challenge one of Europe's last dictators. Her father, Heyohi, worked as a driver at the local concrete factory, his hands permanently stained with dust from the materials that built the socialist dream. Her mother, Valentina, served meals in the factory cafeteria, ladling out portions of borscht and black bread to workers who talked in hushed voices about shortages and rumours from Moscow. The Pilipchuk family lived simply, like most Soviet families, making do with what the state provided and finding small joys in books, family gatherings, and the hope that tomorrow might be better than today. On April 26, 1986, when Sviatlana was just 3 years old, the world changed forever. The explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, just 200 kilometers south of Mikashevichy, sent a radioactive plume across Belarus, Ukraine, and beyond. While the Soviet authorities initially tried to downplay the disaster, the invisible contamination settled into the soil, the water, and the bodies of millions of people. Belarus, despite having no nuclear power plants of its own, received 70% of the radioactive fallout. The village of Mikashevichy, nestled in the Gomel region, found itself uncomfortably close to what would become known as the exclusion zone. For young Sviatlana, this geographical accident would prove to be both a burden and an unexpected gift. In 1994, when Sviatlana was 12 years old, she received an unexpected invitation that would shape her understanding of freedom for the rest of her life. The Chernobyl Lifeline Charity, an Irish organisation dedicated to helping children affected by the nuclear disaster, selected her for their summer programme. For the first time in her life, she would travel beyond the borders of the former Soviet Union. The journey to Ireland was like travelling to another planet. The Dean family, Henry, Marion, and their children, Mary and David, welcomed her into their home in Rahins, County Tipperary, a green landscape so different from the forests and fields of Belarus that still bore invisible scars from Chernobyl. Here, she discovered a world where the government served the people rather than the other way around, where newspapers criticized politicians without fear, and where children could speak their minds without looking over their shoulders. Ireland felt like a more cheerful place than Belarus, she would later recall, but it wasn't just the absence of fear that struck her. It was the presence of something she had never experienced before: genuine civic engagement. People participated in their democracy not because they were forced to, but because they believed their voices mattered. As one of hundreds of thousands of children from areas affected by Chernobyl who spent summer vacations in the West, Sviatlana formed deep bonds with her host family. She returned to Ireland for 3 consecutive summers, each visit reinforcing her growing understanding that life could be different, that governments could be accountable, and that freedom was not just an abstract concept but a lived reality. Her role as translator for other Belarusian children who couldn't speak English also revealed an early glimpse of her natural leadership abilities. She found herself bridging 2 worlds, helping her fellow Chernobyl children navigate this strange new environment while absorbing lessons about democracy that would lie dormant for decades. Back in Mikashevichi, these summers felt like beautiful dreams. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991, but in Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko had seized power in 1994, quickly moving to consolidate authoritarian control. The brief window of democratic possibility that had opened after independence was rapidly closing, and the lessons of those Irish summers seemed increasingly irrelevant to daily life in Belarus. But seeds had been planted in the mind of a young girl who now understood that another way of living was possible. After graduating from school in 2000, Sviatlana continued her education at Moser State Pedagogical University, where she specialized in English and German. Her linguistic skills, honed during those summers in Ireland, opened doors to work as a translator and teacher. It was during her university years that she met Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, a charismatic young man who owned a nightclub in Gomel and seemed full of entrepreneurial energy. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of a Belarus that was steadily becoming more authoritarian. Lukashenko was consolidating power, eliminating opposition figures, and creating a system where dissent was increasingly dangerous. But for young people like Sviatlana and Sviatlana, focused on building their careers and starting a family, politics felt distant and irrelevant. They married in 2004, and Sviatlana threw herself into supporting their growing businesses while pursuing her teaching career. She worked with various companies, including continuing her relationship with the Irish charity Chernobyl Lifeline, which helped maintain her connection to the wider world beyond Belarus's increasingly closed borders. When their son was born with hearing difficulties requiring a cochlear implant, Sviatlana made a hard decision. She stepped back from her career to focus on her family's needs. Their daughter followed a few years later, and by 2015, Sviatlana had settled into the role of full-time mother. It was a choice that reflected both love and pragmatism. In Belarus, mothers of disabled children received little support from the state, and the complex medical needs of their son required constant attention. Sviatlana learned to navigate the bureaucratic maze of Belarus's healthcare system and created a nurturing environment where her children could thrive despite the challenges they faced. To outside observers, the Tsikhanouskaya family appeared to have achieved the post-Soviet dream: modest prosperity, healthy children, and the freedom to pursue their interests without interference from the state. But beneath this peaceful surface, changes were stirring that would soon shatter their quiet life forever. While Sviatlana focused on domestic life, her husband Sviatlana was undergoing his own transformation. What began as frustration with bureaucratic hurdles in establishing a farmstead near Gomel evolved into something much larger and more dangerous. The couple had dreamed of creating a small agricultural business, but every interaction with government officials revealed new layers of corruption, incompetence, and indifference. By 2018, Sviatlana's frustration had crystallized into action. He launched a YouTube channel called Country for Life, a modest venture that would grow into one of the most significant independent media voices in Belarus. With a small team of volunteers and a simple mission, interview ordinary citizens about their lives under Lukashenko's regime, he began traveling across the country. The format was deceptively simple. Sviatlana would arrive in a town or village, set up his camera in a public square, and ask people to share their stories. He didn't push a particular political agenda or offer sophisticated analysis. Instead, he created space for Belarusians to speak honestly about their lives, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. The response was electric. For decades, state-controlled media had presented a sanitized version of life in Belarus, where problems were minor, progress was constant, and President Lukashenko was universally beloved. But Sviatlana's videos revealed a different reality: pensioners struggling to survive on monthly payments, young people emigrating because they saw no future at home, entrepreneurs crushed by corruption and bureaucracy. The channel's most popular video, which would eventually garner almost 1 million views, featured a woman from the town of Sviatlana sharing her struggles and her feelings about Lukashenko. It was powerful precisely because it was so ordinary, a regular citizen telling her truth to a camera operated by another regular citizen. In a country where independent journalism was increasingly dangerous, this grassroots approach to storytelling proved effective. Sviatlana began using the slogan, "Stop the Cockroach," a reference to a beloved Soviet-era children's poem by Kornei Tchaikovsky about a dictatorial insect who terrorized all the other animals until a brave sparrow finally ate him. The metaphor resonated with audiences who understood exactly which cockroach needed to be stopped. Supporters would bring slippers to rallies, symbolizing their desire to stomp out the cockroach of authoritarian rule. At home, Sviatlana watched her husband's growing activism with a mixture of pride and growing concern. She understood the importance of what he was doing, giving voice to the voiceless, creating a space for genuine dialogue about Belarus's future. But she also understood the risks in a country where independent journalists disappeared, opposition politicians were imprisoned, and even casual criticism of the president could result in arrest. By May 2020, the Country for Life channel had 140,000 subscribers, more than 12 times the number following Belarus's state-run television channel. For a government that controlled virtually all traditional media, this represented a fundamental threat. Independent voices reaching hundreds of thousands of people, citizens sharing unfiltered opinions about their government. This was exactly the kind of disorder that authoritarian systems cannot tolerate. The family's quiet life was about to come to an abrupt end. On May 6, 2020, everything changed with the screech of brakes and the knock of police batons on car windows. Sviatlana was travelling near Mogilev with his camera crew when they were stopped by Belarusian police. What followed was a calculated intimidation session designed to send a clear message. Independent journalism would not be tolerated, and those who persisted would face severe consequences. The officers threatened Sviatlana and his team, made it clear they were being watched, and released them with the understanding that this was a final warning. But instead of being deterred, Sviatlana made a decision that would change the course of Belarusian history. The next day, May 7, 2020, Sviatlana announced his intention to run for president of Belarus, directly challenging Lukashenko's bid for a sixth term in office. It was an audacious move. Independent candidates in Belarusian elections typically faced insurmountable obstacles: restricted access to media, harassment of supporters, bureaucratic barriers to registration, and the constant threat of arrest on fabricated charges. But Sviatlana's YouTube following had given him something previous opposition candidates lacked: a direct line of communication to hundreds of thousands of supporters. The announcement sent shockwaves through both the government and the opposition. For Lukashenko, who had grown comfortable with stage-managed elections against token opponents, the prospect of facing a candidate with genuine popular support was genuinely threatening. For the opposition, which had been demoralized by decades of failure, Sviatlana's candidacy offered something that had been missing for years: hope. 2 days later, on May 9th, those hopes were brutally dashed. During an anti-parade protest in Belarus, a counter-demonstration to Lukashenko's Victory Day parade, Sviatlana and about 15 others were arrested. While most were released quickly, Sviatlana faced serious charges that everyone understood to be politically motivated. In the space of 72 hours, the Tsikhanouskaya family had gone from obscurity to the center of Belarusian politics. Sviatlana was in prison, his presidential campaign was in limbo, and his supporters were looking for someone to carry the torch forward. Sviatlana found herself thrust into a role she had never sought and never wanted. With her husband imprisoned, someone needed to continue his campaign, but the Central Election Commission had refused to register his candidacy, claiming procedural violations that everyone understood to be politically motivated. On a warm day in May, sitting in their now empty apartment, Sviatlana made a decision that would change her life forever. She would run for president herself. "I did this solely as a show of support for my husband," she would later explain. "It was meant to be symbolic, a placeholder candidacy to keep Sviatlana's movement alive until he could be freed." She had no political experience, no burning ambition for office, and no desire to become a public figure. She was simply a wife trying to support her imprisoned husband and a mother trying to protect her children's future. But as she began the process of collecting the 100,000 signatures required to register as a candidate, something unexpected happened. People responded to her in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Perhaps it was precisely because she didn't want to be president that people found her so compelling. Here was a woman who openly admitted her limitations, who promised to step down as soon as fair elections could be held, who spoke not in political rhetoric, but in the language of an ordinary citizen, frustrated with her country's direction. Her first public appearances were tentative, almost reluctant. She read from prepared statements, her voice sometimes shaking with nervousness, but there was something authentic about her vulnerability that connected with audiences in ways that polished political speeches never could. "I'm just a regular woman," she would say at rally after rally. "I'm not a politician. I'm a mother who wants a better future for her children." In a country exhausted by decades of political theatre, this simple honesty was revolutionary. Sviatlana wasn't the only woman thrust into politics by circumstance. As Lukashenko's regime systematically eliminated male opposition leaders through arrest, exile, or intimidation, their female relatives found themselves stepping into roles they had never sought. Veronika Tsepkalo, the wife of opposition candidate Valery Tsepkalo, fled the country when her husband was forced into exile and faced credible threats to his safety. Maria Kolesnikova, campaign manager for popular banker Viktor Babarika, watched her candidate get arrested on charges everyone knew were fabricated. Each of these women had been connected to the political opposition, primarily through the men in their lives. But now they found themselves at the center of the struggle for Belarus's future. Together, these three women formed an alliance that would reshape Belarusian politics and challenge every assumption about gender, power, and resistance in the former Soviet space. They appeared together at rallies holding hands, each representing different segments of the opposition, but united in their determination to challenge Lukashenko's rule. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. Three women, all connected to men who had been imprisoned or exiled for daring to seek political change, standing together against a regime that had systematically eliminated male opposition leaders. Their very presence challenged Lukashenko's macho authoritarianism and offered a different vision of political leadership, one based on cooperation rather than domination, dialogue rather than intimidation. Lukashenko, who had once dismissed the idea of a female president by saying, "Our society has not matured enough to vote for a woman," clearly underestimated what was happening. He allowed Sviatlana's candidacy to proceed, apparently believing that a housewife with no political experience posed no real threat to his quarter-century hold on power. He could not have been more wrong. The three women complemented each other perfectly. Sviatlana brought authenticity and emotional connection with ordinary citizens. Veronika contributed policy expertise and connections to the business community. Maria provided organizational skills and a deep network within civil society. Together, they created a campaign that was unlike anything Belarus had ever seen. As summer 2020 progressed, something extraordinary began happening across Belarus. Sviatlana's campaign rallies drew crowds that dwarfed anything seen in the country's post-Soviet history. In Brest, 20,000 people gathered to hear her speak. In Grodno, similar numbers turned out. And in Minsk, the crowds reached an estimated 220,000, larger than many capital cities and representing roughly 1/10 of the country's total population. The atmosphere at these rallies was unlike anything Belarus had experienced in its modern history. People wore white and red, the colours of Belarus's historical flag, banned by Lukashenko in favour of a Soviet-style design. They brought flowers, families came with children, elderly couples stood alongside university students. The crowds were peaceful, hopeful, and diverse in ways that defied the regime's attempts to characterize opposition supporters as extremists or foreign agents. The visual impact was stunning. Aerial photographs showed seas of people stretching as far as the camera could capture, most dressed in white with red accents, many carrying the forbidden white-red-white flag. It was a peaceful revolution in the making, conducted in broad daylight with families picnicking on the grass between speeches. Sviatlana's message was simple and powerful: release political prisoners, limit presidential terms through constitutional reform, and hold new fair elections. Once these goals were achieved, she promised to step down. This wasn't about personal ambition, it was about creating space for genuine democracy to flourish. Her speeches evolved from those early nervous readings of prepared statements to confident addresses that connected emotionally with huge audiences. She learned to pause for applause, to read the mood of the crowd, to vary her tone for emphasis. But she never lost the quality that had attracted people to her in the first place: her fundamental ordinariness, her obvious reluctance to be in this position, and her credible promise that she didn't want to be president forever. "We want free elections," she would tell audiences, drawing thunderous applause. The line became a rallying cry that captured perfectly the aspirations of people who were tired of authoritarian rule, but realistic about the challenges of democratic transition. But the campaign took its toll. The threatening phone calls came regularly, always with the same message: "We will put you behind bars and place your children in an orphanage." The specificity of the threats, mentioning her children by name, describing exactly where they went to school, made clear that this was not random intimidation, but systematic, psychological warfare. Faced with escalating threats against her family, Sviatlana made one of the most agonizing decisions of her life. She arranged for her children to travel to Lithuania, where they would be safe with relatives during the election period. The separation was devastating for a mother who had devoted the previous several years to her children's care, but the alternative, keeping them in Belarus while campaigning against Lukashenko, was simply too dangerous. "There must be a symbol of freedom," she explained her decision to continue despite the dangers. But symbols, she was learning, came at an enormous personal cost. As the August 9th election approached, the regime's response grew increasingly desperate and violent. Opposition candidates continued to be arrested or disqualified on fabricated charges. Independent media faced unprecedented pressure, with journalists beaten, arrested, and forced to flee the country. Internet access was periodically cut in what appeared to be tests of the government's ability to control information flow during a crisis. The night before the election, senior staff from Sviatlana's campaign were detained in what appeared to be a final attempt to disrupt the opposition's get-out-the-vote efforts. Maria Kalesnikava and several other key organisers spent election eve in jail rather than making final preparations for what everyone knew would be a decisive moment in Belarus's history. On election day, August 9th, 2020, Sviatlana went into hiding in Minsk before emerging to vote at her designated polling station. The symbolism of the moment was not lost on her. A few months earlier, she'd been an unknown housewife, and now she was potentially about to become the first woman elected president in Belarusian history. But even as she cast her ballot, reports were already coming in of irregularities at polling stations across the country. Opposition observers were being expelled, vote counts were being conducted in secret, and early returns suggested massive fraud in favour of Lukashenko. Independent exit polls conducted by opposition supporters suggested that Sviatlana had won 60 to 70% of the vote, a landslide that would have represented one of the most dramatic political upheavals in post-Soviet history. But as the evening progressed, it became clear that the official results would tell a very different story. When the Central Election Commission announced that Lukashenko had won more than 80% of the vote while Sviatlana received just over 10%, the absurdity of the numbers was obvious to everyone, including some government supporters. The stolen election was not just a personal betrayal for Sviatlana and her supporters, it was a moment of national awakening for Belarus. Millions of people who had participated peacefully in the democratic process now faced the reality that their votes meant nothing, that their voices would not be heard, and that change would not come through normal political channels. What happened next would determine not just the future of Belarus, but the future of democracy in Eastern Europe. The evening of August 9th, 2020, marked the beginning of the largest protests in Belarus's modern history, and one of the most significant challenges to authoritarian rule in the post-Soviet space. As fraudulent election results were announced on state television, thousands of people poured into the streets of Minsk, Brest, Vitebsk, Grodno, and other cities across the country. What began as peaceful demonstrations quickly met with brutal police response that shocked even seasoned observers of Belarusian politics. Security forces used rubber bullets, stun grenades, water cannons, and tear gas against protesters. They beat people with batons, fired lead ball grenades into crowds, and pursued fleeing demonstrators through the suburbs throughout the night. The violence was systematic and extreme, a deliberate message to anyone considering resistance. Police cordoned off entire neighbourhoods, conducting random arrests of anyone who appeared to be heading toward or returning from protest sites. Hospitals filled with injured protesters, many showing signs of severe beatings. The independent media that tried to document the violence found themselves targets as well, with journalists beaten and their equipment destroyed. Over 30,000 people were detained in the following months, with many describing torture and abuse in custody. The scale and brutality of the crackdown revealed the true nature of Lukashenko's regime to millions of Belarusians who had previously avoided politics or given the government the benefit of the doubt. Sviatlana spent that night in her empty apartment, pacing back and forth, her life in turmoil. Her husband was in prison, her children were in exile, and outside her windows, the Belarus she thought she knew was being torn apart by violence. The sounds of sirens, explosions, and shouting continued throughout the night, punctuated by the periodic wail of ambulances rushing to collect the wounded. She tried calling supporters and campaign staff, but many phones went unanswered. Some of her closest advisors had been arrested in the pre-election crackdown. Others were in hiding or had fled the country. The carefully constructed campaign organisation that had seemed so powerful just hours earlier was disintegrating under the weight of state violence. The next morning, August 10th, she and her lawyer went to the Central Election Commission to officially challenge the results. She still believed, perhaps naively, that there might be some legal remedy, some way to address the obvious fraud through official channels. What happened next would haunt her for the rest of her life and mark the end of any illusions about the possibility of peaceful change in Lukashenko's Belarus. Inside the Election Commission building, Sviatlana found herself facing not electoral officials, but some of the most notorious enforcers in Lukashenko's regime. The meeting wasn't about vote counts or procedures. It was an ultimatum delivered with the clinical precision of experienced interrogators. Andrei Pavlyuchenko, one of Lukashenko's most feared associates, laid out the choice with brutal clarity. Leave Belarus immediately or face imprisonment while her children were placed in state orphanages. There was no negotiation, no possibility of compromise, no legal process. Just a stark choice between exile and destruction. The threats weren't abstract. Pavlyuchenko and his associates described in vivid detail what prison would be like for a political prisoner, where torture was routine and conditions were deliberately inhumane. They painted an equally horrifying picture of what would happen to her children as wards of an authoritarian state that had already demonstrated its willingness to use violence against its own citizens. Sviatlana tried to negotiate, offering to end her challenge to the election results and leave the country in exchange for her husband's freedom. The offer was refused. Siarhe would remain in prison regardless of what she did. But she was able to secure the release of her campaign manager, Maria Moroz, in what appeared to be a small gesture of mercy that only emphasized how powerless she had become. As she prepared to leave the building and the country, Sviatlana collected only her passport and her son's cochlear implant equipment. Before departing, she and Moroz made one final demand that revealed just how dangerous the situation had become. They insisted that a KGB agent escort them to the border in Moroz's car, not out of courtesy, but from fear that the vehicle might have been rigged with explosives. In authoritarian Belarus, even this level of paranoia was rational. A video was subsequently released, showing Sviatlana conceding to Lukashenko and asking protesters to stand down. The stark change in her demeanour from confident candidate to broken-seeming woman led allies to describe it as resembling a hostage video, which in many ways it was. She had been forced to choose between her own safety and the movement she had helped create, and she chose to live. On August 11th, Lithuanian Foreign Minister Linas Linkevičius confirmed that Sviatlana was safe in Lithuania. But safety came at an enormous personal cost that would continue to torment her for years to come. I felt that I had betrayed my supporters by leaving the country. She would later reflect on this moment of profound moral crisis. The guilt was overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of people had trusted her, had believed in the possibility of change, and she had been forced to abandon them to save her own life and protect her children. But something remarkable happened in the days following her escape from Belarus. Rather than disappearing into the safety of exile, rather than accepting defeat and trying to rebuild her shattered personal life, Sviatlana made a decision that would define the next phase of her life and the democracy movement she had helped launch. She declared herself the leader of democratic Belarus and announced the formation of a coordination council to manage the transfer of power from Lukashenko. It was an audacious move that surprised even her closest supporters. Here was a woman who had never sought political office, who had entered politics only to support her imprisoned husband, now claiming leadership of a nation of 9.5 million people, based on what she believed was her legitimate electoral victory. The Coordination Council represented a sophisticated attempt to create parallel institutions that could serve as an alternative to Lukashenko's government. It brought together respected professionals, authors, athletes, and civil society leaders, including Nobel Prize-winning author Sviatlana Alexievich. Membership was open to any Belarusian who recognized the election as fraudulent and held a position of social trust. The council's structure reflected a conscious attempt to avoid the personalized leadership that had characterized Belarusian politics under Lukashenko. Instead of concentrating power in a single leader, it distributed authority among different working groups focused on specific areas: legal reform, economic transition, media freedom, and international relations. International recognition followed surprisingly quickly. While most governments stopped short of recognizing Sviatlana as Belarus's legitimate president, Lithuania officially acknowledged her as the country's rightful leader. The European Parliament awarded her and other opposition figures the Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought. She began meeting with world leaders, including Joe Biden, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and Justin Trudeau. These meetings were surreal for a woman who had been a housewife just months earlier, but Sviatlana adapted quickly to the demands of international diplomacy, learning to navigate complex negotiations about sanctions, humanitarian aid, and diplomatic pressure. Her natural intelligence and obvious sincerity made her an effective advocate for the Belarusian cause on the world stage, but recognition abroad couldn't erase the guilt and exhaustion she felt about the situation back home. "I feel so emotionally exhausted," she admitted in interviews. "Sometimes I doubt I made the correct decision." The weight of representing millions of people while being unable to return to her own country was crushing. Back in Belarus, the crackdown continued with ruthless efficiency that revealed the true nature of Lukashenko's regime. Over 33,000 people were detained between August 2020 and early 2021, with more than 900 facing serious criminal charges carrying sentences of up to 15 years. The UN Human Rights Office documented over 450 cases of torture and ill treatment, including sexual abuse. The stories emerging from Belarusian prisons were horrifying. Detainees described being forced to stand in stress positions for hours, being beaten with batons, having their heads shaved forcibly, and being subjected to sexual humiliation. Women reported being threatened with rape, while men described mock executions and psychological torture designed to break their will. Protesters died under suspicious circumstances that raised questions about the regime's willingness to use lethal force against its own citizens. Alexander Tarikovsky was shot near a Minsk metro station on August 10th, despite official claims that he had injured himself with an explosive device. Video evidence later contradicted this account, showing him falling after being hit by something fired from police lines. Roman Bondarenko was beaten to death in November after being kidnapped from his apartment courtyard for wearing a white red-white ribbon. Others simply disappeared or died in custody under questionable circumstances that were never properly investigated. The regime's brutality extended far beyond protesters to anyone associated with the opposition movement. Journalists were beaten, imprisoned, and forced to flee the country in what amounted to the systematic destruction of independent media. Religious leaders faced persecution for supporting the democracy movement or even for offering prayers for political prisoners. The entire independent media landscape was methodically dismantled. Belsat TV was banned, TUT.by was stripped of its media license, and its journalists arrested, and dozens of websites were blocked. Even cultural figures found themselves targets. Musicians who performed songs associated with the protests were banned from concerts. Artists who created works supporting the democracy movement saw their exhibitions cancelled. Teachers who expressed sympathy for the opposition were fired from their jobs. The message was clear: there would be no space for dissent in any form. The psychological warfare was as systematic as the physical repression. Families of detained protesters received anonymous phone calls describing in graphic detail what was happening to their loved ones in prison. Employers were pressured to fire workers who had participated in protests. University students faced expulsion for political activity. The regime was attempting to atomize society, to break the bonds of solidarity that had made the mass protests possible. Even in exile, Sviatlana wasn't safe from the regime's reach. In 2023, she was tried in absentia and sentenced to 15 years in prison on charges of attempting to overthrow the government. Her organizations were declared extremist formations, making her subject to immediate arrest should she ever return to Belarus. The sentence was both a legal threat and a psychological weapon, ensuring that she could never safely return home. Her husband Serhiy faced an even harsher fate. After being held in pre-trial detention for over a year under increasingly harsh conditions, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison on charges of attempting to violently overthrow the government, essentially for creating YouTube videos that criticized Lukashenko. The trial was conducted in secret, without independent observers, and with evidence that included his peaceful interviews with ordinary citizens. If he serves the full term, Serhiy will be over 60 years old when released. For a man whose only crime was giving voice to his fellow citizens, it was a sentence designed to destroy not just him, but his family and everyone who might consider following his example. As protests in Belarus were crushed and the opposition was systematically dismantled, Sviatlana transformed herself from an accidental candidate into a sophisticated international leader. This evolution required her to master skills she had never needed before: diplomatic protocol, international law, media relations, and the complex dynamics of multilateral negotiations. Her first major international appearance was at the European Parliament in September 2020, just weeks after fleeing Belarus. Standing before hundreds of parliamentarians from across Europe, she delivered a speech that would establish her credibility as a serious political figure, rather than simply a symbol of resistance. "Today we are going through the darkest period in the modern history of Belarus," she told the assembly, her voice steady despite the enormous pressure she was under. "But I believe that we are strong enough to overcome this period. The Belarusian people have tasted freedom. We will not go back." The speech marked a turning point in how the international community viewed the Belarusian opposition. This was not just an emotional appeal from a desperate exile, but a strategic presentation from someone who understood the complexities of international relations and could articulate a realistic path forward for her country. Over the following months and years, Sviatlana travelled across Europe and North America, building support for sanctions against Lukashenko's regime and maintaining international attention on Belarus. She met with presidents, prime ministers, and foreign ministers, learning to navigate the intricate world of diplomacy while never losing sight of her ultimate goal: free and fair elections in Belarus. The work was exhausting and often frustrating. Western governments expressed sympathy and imposed sanctions, but the concrete help that might actually change the situation in Belarus was limited. Russia's support for Lukashenko, including billions in aid and the implicit threat of military intervention, made the dictator nearly invulnerable to international pressure. In meeting after meeting, Sviatlana found herself explaining the same basic points: that Belarus was not Russia, that the Belarusian people deserved the right to choose their own government, and that supporting democracy in Belarus was in the West's strategic interest. The repetition was maddening, but she understood that international attention spans were short, and that maintaining focus on Belarus required constant effort. In February 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Sviatlana found her cause both helped and hindered by the larger conflict. On one hand, the war demonstrated the dangers of allowing dictatorships to flourish in Europe and showed what happened when authoritarian leaders were emboldened by international passivity. On the other hand, international attention and resources were necessarily focused on the active war in Ukraine rather than the slower-burning crisis in Belarus. Lukashenko's decision to allow Russian forces to use Belarus as a staging ground for the invasion created a new set of challenges for the opposition. Many Belarusians were horrified to see their country used as a platform for aggression against a neighbouring nation, but protests against the war met with even harsher repression than the 2020 democracy demonstrations. Underground resistance took on new forms. Railway workers sabotaged tracks used to transport Russian military equipment to Ukraine. Hackers targeted government and military websites. Activists spray-painted anti-war graffiti despite harsh penalties. The resistance had gone underground but had not disappeared. Sviatlana worked to ensure that the international community understood the connection between the struggles for democracy in Belarus and Ukraine. Both countries were fighting against Russian imperialism, she argued, and both deserved international support. The fact that one fight had taken the form of armed resistance, while the other remained largely peaceful, didn't make either less legitimate. She developed what she called the Peremóha Plan, Victory Plan, a comprehensive strategy for coordinating underground resistance in Belarus with international pressure. The plan included detailed provisions for supporting civil society, maintaining communication networks, and preparing for a future democratic transition. But she was also realistic about the challenges ahead. "We must wait until the right moment," she explained to supporters, "when instability allows for a change in power." The war in Ukraine had made Lukashenko more dependent than ever on Russian support, but it had also revealed the limitations of Russian power and the potential for rapid political change. Behind the international awards and diplomatic meetings, Sviatlana struggled with the enormous personal cost of her accidental leadership. Her children were growing up in exile, separated from their father, who remained imprisoned in Belarus. She lived with constant security concerns and the knowledge that she could never safely return to her homeland. The transformation from housewife to international political leader had happened so quickly that she sometimes struggled to recognize herself in the mirror. "It is so difficult to understand and realize that on your decisions so much depends," she reflected in quiet moments between public appearances. The guilt was particularly overwhelming. Every day brought news of new arrests, new sentences, new tragedies affecting people who had supported her campaign. She carried the weight of knowing that her decision to run for president had set in motion events that had destroyed thousands of lives. The fact that she hadn't sought this responsibility didn't make it any easier to bear. Video calls with Siahe after years in imprisonment were heartbreaking reminders of everything the family had lost. He aged visibly in prison, his health deteriorating under harsh conditions designed to break political prisoners. Their son and daughter struggled with the absence of their father during crucial developmental years. Yet Sviatlana also recognized the profound change that had occurred in Belarus, regardless of who remained in power. "People have started to feel that we are a nation," she observed during one of her many interviews. "They started to feel proud of this fact. We've been sleeping for 26 years. We thought after every election there would be a rise of people, but it was brutally cracked down on. This time, however, I see a profound shift." The evidence of this shift was everywhere, despite the repression. The white red-white flag that had been largely forgotten during the Soviet era had become a symbol of resistance, flown secretly in apartments and displayed at great personal risk. The traditional cry, "Long live Belarus," had replaced the resigned silence that had characterized public life for decades. Even the language was changing. Young Belarusians were increasingly choosing to speak Belarusian rather than Russian, asserting their distinct national identity in ways that would have been unthinkable before 2020. Cultural figures who had never been political were creating works that celebrated Belarusian identity and values. By 2024, Nearly 4 years after the election that changed her life, Sviatlana had settled into the long, grinding work of opposition leadership. The initial wave of protests had been crushed. The mass rallies were a memory, and many of her original supporters had either fled the country or been imprisoned. But the underlying conditions that had created the 2020 uprising remained unchanged. Lukashenko's legitimacy had been permanently damaged by the obviously fraudulent election and the brutal crackdown that followed. His regime was now entirely dependent on Russian support and domestic repression, a combination that created its own instabilities. Economic problems continued to mount as sanctions took their toll and international investment dried up. The democracy movement had been driven underground, but not eliminated. Partisan activities continued despite harsh penalties. Railway lines used to transport Russian military equipment to Ukraine were regularly sabotaged. Government websites faced constant cyber attacks, and information campaigns reached Belarusians through encrypted channels. The Peremoha plan was slowly being implemented by brave individuals who remained in Belarus at enormous personal risk. Sviatlana had evolved from reluctant candidate to seasoned opposition leader, but she maintained her original commitment to democratic principles. She regularly consulted with other opposition figures, refused to make unilateral decisions about Belarus's future, and continued to promise that she would not seek to become Belarus's permanent president. "Decisions about my own political future will come later," she explained in a 2024 interview. "Should Lukashenko face trial? As a person, I cannot forgive his crimes. But for the future of Belarus, he can leave for Russia, or wherever, or stay in his house. But if you have to think globally, sometimes you have to take such decisions." This pragmatic approach, painful for many who had suffered under the regime, reflected her transformation from an idealistic housewife into a practical politician who understood that sustainable change sometimes required difficult compromises. The woman who had once believed that simply exposing electoral fraud would be enough to change the government now understood the complex realities of power, international relations, and historical change. What made Sviatlana's exile leadership effective was not just her personal story, but the sophisticated network of resistance that had developed around her. The Coordination Council had evolved into a complex organization with representatives across Europe and North America, maintaining contact with underground networks inside Belarus while building international support for democratic change. The technological aspect of this resistance was particularly innovative. Encrypted messaging apps allowed secure communication between exiles and activists inside Belarus. Virtual reality meetings enabled opposition figures to attend rallies and conferences despite being scattered across different countries. Cryptocurrency donations provided funding for humanitarian aid and resistance activities while avoiding government surveillance. Social media campaigns kept international attention focused on Belarus, even as other crises dominated headlines. The Belarus Revolution hashtag continued to trend periodically, driven by coordinated efforts to share stories of political prisoners, document ongoing repression, and maintain pressure for sanctions against the regime. Educational initiatives were equally important. Sviatlana worked with international universities to establish scholarship programs for Belarusian students who could not study freely in their home country. Online courses in democratic governance, human rights, and civil society development prepared a new generation of leaders for an eventual transition. The woman who addressed a small gathering in Vilnius on the 5th anniversary of the 2020 election was almost unrecognizable from the nervous housewife who had first announced her candidacy. Sviatlana spoke with the confidence of someone who had met with world leaders, the gravitas of someone who had carried the hopes of millions, and the wisdom of someone who had learned the true cost of political leadership. Her children, now teenagers, sat in the front row, their presence a reminder of everything that had been sacrificed and everything that was still at stake. "We are not the same people who took to the streets 5 years ago," she told the audience of exiles, activists, and international supporters. "We have been tested by repression, educated by exile, and strengthened by solidarity. We know now that freedom is not something that can be given to us. It is something we must create and defend ourselves." The speech reflected her evolution from someone who had stumbled into politics to someone who truly understood its possibilities and limitations. She no longer promised easy victories or quick solutions. Instead, she offered something more valuable: a realistic assessment of the challenges ahead and a credible strategy for meeting them. "Change will come," she concluded, "not because we wish for it, but because we work for it. Not because the world owes us freedom, but because we have proven ourselves worthy of it. The Belarus we dreamed of in 2020 is still possible, but it will require everything we have learned and more than we ever imagined." Perhaps the most painful aspect of Sviatlana's leadership was her ongoing responsibility to the hundreds of political prisoners who remained in Belarusian jails. Every decision she made had to consider not just the abstract goal of democratic change, but the immediate reality of people suffering in prison because they had supported her candidacy. The list of political prisoners had grown to over 1,400 people by 2025, including opposition leaders, civil society activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens whose only crime had been expressing support for democracy. Many faced sentences of 10 to 20 years for participating in protests or sharing opposition content on social media. Sviatlana maintained detailed files on each prisoner, working with human rights organizations to document their conditions and advocate for their release. She regularly met with family members of political prisoners, carrying their stories to international audiences and ensuring that the human cost of Lukashenko's repression was never forgotten. The psychological burden of this responsibility was enormous. Every international meeting began with her reading names of political prisoners, a ritual that served both to honor their sacrifice and to remind comfortable Western politicians of the stakes involved. She carried photographs of prisoners to every public appearance, making sure their faces were visible even when their voices were silenced. Some prisoners had been her personal friends and campaign staff. Others were people she had never met but who had been inspired by her example to take risks for democracy. All of them represented a moral debt that she could never fully repay, no matter how successful her international advocacy became. The families of political prisoners became her closest advisors and harshest critics. They understood better than anyone the real consequences of political strategy, and they weren't impressed by diplomatic niceties when their loved ones were being tortured in prison. Their demands for action pushed Sviatlana to take positions that were sometimes diplomatically inconvenient but morally necessary. One of the most difficult questions Sviatlana faced as opposition leader was whether the Belarusian resistance should remain strictly peaceful or consider other forms of struggle. The debate became more urgent after Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrated the effectiveness of armed resistance against authoritarian aggression. Some supporters argued that peaceful protest had failed, that Lukashenko only understood force, and that the opposition needed to consider more militant tactics. They pointed to successful resistance movements in other countries that had combined peaceful and armed struggle to achieve their goals. Others maintained that violence would only give the regime justification for even harsher repression and would alienate international supporters who were crucial to the opposition's success. They argued that Belarus's geographic position made armed resistance impractical, and that the movement's moral authority depended on its peaceful character. Sviatlana navigated this debate carefully, recognizing the legitimacy of both perspectives while maintaining her commitment to peaceful change. "We must be smarter than those who oppress us," she argued. "Violence is their language, not ours. Our strength comes from our moral authority, and our unity, not from our weapons. But she also acknowledged the reality of underground resistance activities that went beyond traditional peaceful protest. Railway sabotage, cyber attacks, and other forms of disruption occupied a grey area between peaceful protest and armed resistance. While she didn't explicitly endorse such activities, she didn't condemn them either, understanding that people facing extreme repression had the right to defend themselves. The question became more complex as the war in Ukraine continued, and some Belarusian volunteers joined Ukrainian forces, fighting against Russian aggression. These fighters argued that they were defending not just Ukraine but Belarus, which was being used as a staging ground for Russian imperialism. Sviatlana supported these volunteers while maintaining that the ultimate goal remained peaceful political change in Belarus. Everyone must choose their own path of resistance, she said. Some fight with words, some with underground organizing, some with weapons. All forms of resistance against tyranny have their place. As the years passed, Sviatlana began to see her role less as a permanent leader and more as a bridge between the generation that had lived through Soviet rule and a new generation that took democracy for granted. Young Belarusians who had come of age during the 2020 protests had different expectations and different ideas about how to achieve change. Many of these young activists were more radical than Sviatlana, less willing to compromise with international diplomatic niceties, and more impatient with the slow pace of change. They organised their own protests, created their own media, and developed their own networks that sometimes operated independently of the formal opposition structure. Rather than seeing this as a threat to her leadership, Sviatlana embraced it as a sign of the movement's health and sustainability. Every generation must find its own way to fight for freedom, she observed. My job is not to control the next generation, but to support it and learn from it. She began deliberately stepping back from certain activities, creating space for younger leaders to develop their own skills and credibility. She endorsed young candidates for positions in exile institutions, supported student organizations, and amplified the voices of activists who brought fresh perspectives to old problems. This generational transition was particularly visible in the cultural realm, where young Belarusian artists, musicians, and writers were creating works that reflected their own experiences of resistance and exile. Their art was often more experimental, more international in its influences, and more uncompromising in its politics than the cultural products of earlier generations. The emergence of this new generation also created challenges. Some young activists criticized Sviatlana's moderate approach and called for more confrontational tactics. Others questioned whether someone who had never intended to be a politician should continue to speak for Belarus on the international stage. These criticisms stung, but Sviatlana recognized them as necessary parts of a healthy democratic movement. If we only listen to voices that agree with us, we are no better than those we oppose, she said. Democracy means disagreement, debate, and the right to challenge leaders. The story of Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya raises profound questions about leadership, democracy, and the price of freedom that extend far beyond the borders of Belarus. An ordinary woman thrust into extraordinary circumstances, she demonstrated that political leadership can emerge from the most unexpected places, not from ambition or ideology, but from love and moral necessity. Her journey from English teacher to democracy leader illustrates both the potential and the limitations of grassroots political movements in the face of entrenched authoritarianism. The 2020 protests represented the largest challenge to Lukashenko's rule in his quarter-century in power, but they also revealed the stark realities of trying to change an authoritarian system through peaceful means alone. The revolution Sviatlana helped lead was unfinished. Perhaps all the most important revolutions are. The immediate goal of removing Lukashenko failed, but the deeper transformation of Belarusian society's relationship with power had arguably succeeded. Millions of citizens had rejected the legitimacy of their government, had experienced the power of collective action, and had glimpsed an alternative vision of their country's future. Whether this transformation would ultimately lead to democratic change remained an open question. Authoritarian regimes have proven remarkably resilient when they maintain control of the security forces and receive international support from other autocracies. But they have also shown themselves vulnerable to sudden collapse when the right combination of internal pressure and external circumstances align. Sviatlana's story demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, ordinary people could choose to stand up for their principles, could find the courage to challenge seemingly insurmountable power, and could inspire others to believe that change was possible. Her transformation from reluctant candidate to international leader showed that democratic leadership was not a mystical quality possessed by a chosen few, but a set of skills and commitments that could be learned and developed by anyone willing to serve something larger than themselves. The personal cost of this leadership was enormous and ongoing. 5 years after fleeing Belarus, Sviatlana remained separated from her homeland. Her husband remained in prison, and her children were growing up in exile. The weight of representing millions of people, while being unable to deliver the changes they demanded, was a burden that never lessened. Yet she continued to carry this burden with dignity and determination, understanding that her role was not to single-handedly deliver freedom to Belarus, but to help create the conditions under which Belarusians could eventually free themselves. The Irish summers of her youth, when she had glimpsed what freedom could look like, remained a guiding vision. The cochlear implant she'd grabbed while fleeing Belarus, the device that allowed her son to hear, served as a daily reminder that sometimes the most important things we carry are not for ourselves, but for the next generation. In interviews, she often returned to the theme of awakening. "We have been sleeping for 26 years, she would say, but now we are awake." The sleep had been broken, even if the dawn remained uncertain. The revolution she had accidentally helped start was far from over. In the most important sense, it was just beginning. The white, red-white flag that flew secretly in apartments across Belarus, the traditional cry of "Long live Belarus" that echoed in encrypted chat rooms, and the growing sense of national identity among young Belarusians all testified to changes that no amount of repression could completely reverse. The people had awakened to the possibility of self-determination, and that awakening would outlast any particular leader or regime. As for Sviatlana herself, her story continued to be written, its conclusion unknown. But in the space between exile and return, between defeat and hope, between the woman she had been and the leader she had become, she had achieved something remarkable. She had shown that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, could choose to be extraordinary themselves. The measure of her revolution was not whether it had immediately achieved its goals, but whether it had fundamentally changed how a people understood themselves and their possibilities. By that measure, the accidental revolutionary had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, including her own. Her journey was a reminder that in the great struggles for human freedom, victory is often measured not in years but in generations, not in the capture of palaces but in the transformation of consciousness, not in the defeat of tyrants but in the awakening of peoples to their own power and dignity. The revolution she had helped start was indeed unfinished, but then again, the best revolutions always are. They live not in the moment of their apparent triumph, but in the ongoing work of building more just and democratic societies. They succeed not when they end, but when they inspire others to continue the work of expanding human freedom and dignity. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya's story was ultimately not about one woman's accidental rise to leadership, but about the eternal human struggle for self-determination and the surprising places from which leadership can emerge when it is needed most. It was a story that would continue long after her own role in it had ended, carried forward by other ordinary people who would find within themselves the extraordinary courage to stand up for what they believed was right.